Forget about the Marcoses or the Aquinos. This story is not about them. You're standing in the middle of a highway with nothing but the people beside you. No weapons, no armor, nothing. And coming straight at you, at all of you, is a column of military tanks sent to crush you and everyone around you. This happened in the Philippines in February 1986, and the whole world was watching. But then, suddenly, the tanks stopped. The soldiers inside refused to fire, and within just 4 days, a dictatorship that had ruled for 21 years was finally over, brought down peacefully by millions of people. Just everyday people along a highway called EDSA. Walang anumang armas o anumang sandata. Sa katunayan, ang tanging kalasag lang nila ay ang tapang ng bawat isa. But the thing is, this moment in history did not come out of nowhere. It was built for over a decade by the people whose names you've probably never heard of. In fact, what most people think they know about this revolution is either incomplete or simply wrong. So who exactly made this revolution happen? And why are some people today trying their best to erase it from our memories? Ano nga ba talaga ang diwa ng EDSA People Power Revolution? Ito ba'y nagtagumpay o isang epic fail? Mabuhay! Earn Kapampangan, luwid kayo! Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. It has been 40 years since the EDSA People Power Revolution. And today, whether you know the full story or not, we're gonna walk through what actually happened and answer the biggest question about it. So EDSA, or the Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, is a major highway running through Metro Manila. And in February 1986, it became the site of something that the world had never seen before. Millions of people, millions of ordinary civilians facing down a dictatorship with nothing but their bodies and their courage and their prayers. And the whole world was changed by it. But here's the question that I know a lot of you have asked. Did any of it even matter? To understand why millions of people flooded EDSA in 1986, we need to look back and understand what they were up against. And the thing is, it was way worse than most people realize. Isang katotohanan na pilit ibinabaon sa limot. On September 21, 1972, then-President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. placed the Philippines under martial law, claiming that it was necessary to fight communist insurgency, to fight the rebels. But the thing is, what it actually did was hand all power, the executive, legislative, judicial powers, under one man, the president himself. So Congress was dissolved. The free press was killed overnight, and the only 3 media outlets that survived were all under Marcos's control. Opposition leaders like Senators Ninoy Aquino, Jose Diokno, and Lorenzo Tañada, and so many others were all arrested immediately in the middle of the night. And then came the years of horror. Liliosa Hilao, a 23-year-old student, became the first known detainee killed under martial law, but she was far from the last. According to documentation compiled by Amnesty International and the Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, the Marcos dictatorship was linked to at least 3,257 documented extrajudicial killings, along with 35,000 cases of torture, hundreds of enforced disappearances, and roughly 70,000 incarcerations of political detainees and critics of the regime. And those are only the cases that were documented. Countless more were never recorded. Countless more simply disappeared. In fact, in 1975, Marcos himself admitted to Amnesty International that over 50,000 people had already been arrested in just the first 3 years of martial law. Macliing Dulag, an indigenous Kalinga leader opposing the Chico River Dam, was assassinated by military forces in 1980. Edgar Jopson, a student leader turned revolutionary, was captured and executed in 1982. Macliing Dulag, Edgar Jopson, Liliosa Hilao, and so many others. These names should be as famous as any president or celebrity. And the thing is, those are just a few names. There were thousands more ordinary workers, farmers, students, indigenous people, people whose lives were cut short and whose stories were never told. But the violence was not just about the killing, it was also about the spectacle. Many of those killings were not hidden. Thousands of victims were tortured, mutilated, and their bodies dumped in public. A terror tactic Filipinos came to call salvaging, a chilling euphemism for state-sponsored murder. Meanwhile, the external debt of the Philippines exploded from $360 million in 1962 to $28.3 billion by 1986. And yet today, some people call this era a golden age. But the thing is, none of it would have been possible without the backing of Uncle Sam. The United States provided Marcos with military aid, diplomatic cover, and billions of dollars in support because the Philippines hosted Clark Air Base and Subic Naval Base, two of America's largest and most important overseas military bases. The United States didn't just look the other way. It quite literally bankrolled the dictatorship. 14 years of martial law, 2 decades of one-man rule, and through all of it, Filipinos resisted underground, in the streets, in unions, in churches, in schools, and everywhere in between. The people's resistance never stopped. Kaya kung tutuusin, hindi ang mga politiko, kundi mga ordinaryong mamamayan na nanindigan upang ipaglaban ang ating mga karapatan. And then, in 1983, everything changed. On August 21, 1983, one event blew the whole thing wide open. Senator Aquino returned from exile, but the moment he stepped off the plane in Manila, he was shot dead on the airport tarmac. In front of the cameras, the journalists, and for all the world to see, Ninoy's assassination didn't silence the opposition, but instead, it awakened an entire nation. Millions of Filipinos took to the streets. The yellow ribbon became a symbol of protest. The economy spiraled even further, and the pressure on Marcos became unbearable. In 1985, Marcos himself called for snap elections, and his opponent was Corazon Cory Cojuangco Aquino, Ninoy's own widow, a political outsider who became the face of the opposition. Now, most people think that the story of EDSA starts here, but the thing is, it actually started years earlier, long before Ninoy was assassinated, with the people most EDSA narratives live out, and understanding who they were changes everything you know about this revolution. But here's something that is often erased from most EDSA narratives, from most EDSA stories. The People Power Revolution did not start in February 1986. It was built for over a decade by the people, by the activists, the organizers, the workers, the women, the students, and everyone in between. A broad coalition of Filipinos who risked everything, including their own lives, long before millions of people flooded the famous highway. From the moment martial law was declared, resistance organized across the country, and it came from everywhere, quite literally. The Catholic Church became a crucial space for organizing. Grassroots basic ecclesial communities became centers of political education and community resistance across the provinces. Religious orders worked directly with farmers and indigenous communities. So nuns and priests didn't just show up on EDSA in 1986. Many of them had been organizing for years, long before EDSA. The alternative press, publications like Malaya, Mr. and Miss Magazine, and the underground press networks, they kept the truth alive when the mainstream media was silenced under Marcos' control. Journalists risked everything, imprisonment, and even their own lives to document the regime's abuses. Throughout all of this, women played essential roles at every level, from organizing communities to leading protests to running underground networks, and many of them paid for it with imprisonment and torture. The labor movement was also critical. Workers organized strikes that hit the regime's economic foundations. Peasant organizations mobilized in the countryside, and student orgs organized across universities, across the islands. Historical records show that the Philippine left was a major part of this resistance. In fact, the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army became one of the most organized forces opposing Marcos, growing to roughly 25,000 fighters by the mid-1980s. Now, beyond the armed struggle, the National Democratic Movement also built a massive network on the ground. Labor unions, student orgs, women's groups, broad coalitions building the infrastructure of resistance that became the backbone of the anti-dictatorship movement. They led what Filipinos called Welgang Bayan, literally people strikes, massive strikes that combined transport shutdowns, factory walkouts, and street demonstrations all at once. These were the parliament of the streets. These are the people whose names you'll never see in the headlines. But without them, nothing that happened next would have been possible. After Ninoy Aquino's assassination, the anti-dictatorship movement exploded into the middle class. The Makati Business District became famous for confetti rallies, where office workers threw shredded papers from high-rise buildings. The parliament of the streets was in full swing. Now, the popular narrative reduces EDSA to Aquino versus the Marcoses. 2 families, 2 factions, 1 highway, 4 days. But without the church, without the labor movement, the students, the out-of-school youth, the women, the press, the activists, there is no foundation for what happened on EDSA. So when you tell EDSA as a story about 2 families, about politicians, you are erasing the ordinary Filipinos who actually made this revolution happen. So everything that happened over the past 14 years, the resistance, the organizing, the sacrifices, it all came down to 4 days. 4 days that shook the entire world. It all started with the snap elections of February 7, 1986. It was a complete disaster. NAMFREL, or the National Citizens Movement for Free Elections, mobilized 500,000 volunteer poll watchers. But it didn't matter. 35 technicians from the Commission on Elections, or COMELEC, walked out in protest, publicly declaring that the results were being rigged and tampered with in favor of Marcos. But despite this, on February 15, the Batasang Pambansa, the national legislature controlled by Marcos, declared Marcos the winner anyway. But then, on February 22, Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and General Fidel Valdez Ramos publicly broke away from Marcos and barricaded themselves in Camp Aguinaldo and Camp Crame along EDSA. A planned coup d'etat had been discovered, and they had no choice but to defect. But the thing is, Enrile and Ramos were military men with only a few hundred soldiers. So if Marcos sent his forces, they were finished, definitely. So in short, they needed help, and that help came from the people. The Archbishop of Manila, Jaime Cardinal Sin, went on Radio Veritas, the Catholic Church's own radio station, and he made an urgent appeal. He asked Filipinos to go to EDSA to bring food and supplies and to form a human shield. And this is where history turned. The people came, not politicians, not generals, but everyday people from all walks of life. Most of them didn't even know if they'd make it alive or back home safely the next day. They had no weapons, no armors, but they showed up anyway. Nuns were kneeling in front of tanks, praying the rosary. Here's a quote from Sister Porferia, one of the nuns that day. She said, "When we were facing the tanks, I believed heavily that God was there. Students linked arms as barricades. Mothers brought children. Workers brought sandwiches. An elderly man in a wheelchair manned a barricade. Seminarians carried wooden crosses, their only weapons. Children approached soldiers to hand them flowers." In fact, there were no simple words to describe what it felt like. It was tense, festive, terrifying, hopeful, and empowering all at once. The crowd swelled to over 2 million people along EDSA. Marcos ordered his military to disperse them, but the soldiers refused to fire. Helicopter gunships that were sent to attack landed and defected instead. In fact, Marcos ordered to bomb the rebels, but Colonel Antonio Sotelo had already made his choice. He then asked his pilots one by one if anyone wanted to back out. Not one did. The entire unit defected and landed at Camp Crame. Tanks were stopped not by firepower, but by people offering flowers and prayers. Radio Veritas kept broadcasting, giving blow-by-blow accounts and updates and coordinating the movement. When the radio station's transmitter was destroyed by Marcos, journalist Jude Keithley switched frequencies and kept broadcasting. On the morning of February 25, 1986, on the 4th day, Corazon Coanco Aquino was inaugurated as the 11th President of the Philippines at Club Filipino. Hours later, Ferdinand Marcos and his family fled to Hawaii with the help of their dear friend, U.S. President Ronald Reagan, thus ending 21 years of authoritarian rule. 2 million unarmed civilians facing down a dictatorship, and the soldiers refused to fire on their own people. 4 days, no bloodshed, not because of anyone's mercy, but because the people's resolve was unbreakable. And the thing is, all of that was just what the news cameras saw, what most EDSA narratives focus on. Now, a lot of people today dismiss the people power revolution as just a Manila thing. Rich people along a highway called EDSA in Metro Manila, not the masses in the provinces. But that is not what really happened. That is not the full story. The years of resistance leading up to EDSA were always nationwide. So while the world's cameras were focused on EDSA, solidarity actions erupted across the archipelago. In Cebu, Cardinal Vidal mobilized support from the Visayas. Communities in Davao, Pampanga, Bacolod, Iloilo, Baguio, and others organized their own rallies and demonstrations. Catholic parishes became organizing hubs. Local radio stations relayed updates from Radio Veritas. In many provinces across Luzon, the Visayas, and Mindanao, Filipinos gathered to show solidarity even if they couldn't be physically on EDSA. Labor strikes were happening across the islands. Student movements were active from UP Diliman in Quezon City to Silliman University in Dumaguete. In the Cordilleras, the Kalinga people had been fighting the dictatorship for years. And this struggle didn't stop with the death and the assassination of Macliing Dulag. In fact, his community kept organizing. Now in Mindanao, indigenous Lumad and Muslim communities had long histories of resisting the dictatorship, resisting state violence, facing heavy militarization, forced displacement, and armed conflict throughout the 70s and the 80s. So when the crowds gathered on EDSA, the rest of the country, the rest of the Philippines, was already in motion. In short, EDSA was the climax. But the struggle had always been building nationwide for over a decade. And what happened next surprised the entire world. People power. You hear this phrase everywhere today, in movements across Europe, in protests across Asia, even here in the US. Proudly being used by diverse communities standing in solidarity, by the people fighting for their rights, their dignity, and their liberation. But most people today, including Filipinos, don't actually realize where this phrase came from. This term came from us in the Philippines. You see, when millions of Filipinos peacefully overthrew a 2-decade dictatorship back in 1986, we gave the world people power. Ika nga nila, ito ang naging handog ng mga Pilipino ng sambayanang Pilipino sa buong mundo. Mapayapang paraan ng pagbabago. Sabi nga sa kanta, katotohanan, kalayaan at katarungan ay kayang makamit ng walang dahas. Basta't magkaisa tayong lahat. Sa katunayan, ay napakarami sa buong mundo ang namangha sa ating mga Pilipino at nagkaroon din ng lakas ng loob ng dahil sa EDSA, ng dahil sa ating people power. That phrase, people power, was popularized during this revolution, broadcast around the world from Radio Veritas, and it became a global blueprint. The 1986 revolution in the Philippines was the first successful non-violent overthrow of a dictatorship that was broadcasted live on international television. And after EDSA, movements around the world started drawing directly from what the Filipino people had done. They were inspired by our people power. In South Korea, the June Democracy Movement of 1987 followed the Philippine example. In Myanmar, the 1988 pro-democracy uprising challenged military rule. In Taiwan, the Wild Lily student movement of 1990 demanded full democratic elections. In Indonesia, mass protests toppled Suharto in 1998 after 31 years of tyranny. All were inspired by EDSA. Now in Europe, EDSA became a model for the wave of revolutions that followed. From Poland's Solidarity movement and its 1989 breakthrough elections to Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution later that same year. And finally, the historic fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. Symbolically ending the Cold War. In fact, a section of the Berlin Wall now stands along EDSA, a gift from Germany to the Filipino people in recognition of our people power revolution and our shared history of bringing down the walls of tyranny. But it didn't stop there. The echoes kept going, like in the Arab Spring of 2011, where millions of ordinary people, ordinary civilians across Tunisia and Egypt toppled decades-long dictators, demanding the same things Filipinos demanded in 1986, an end to tyranny. So from Seoul to Jakarta, from Berlin to Prague, and decades later, from Kiev to Cairo, the echoes of the Filipino people power revolution could be heard around the world. That is our contribution to world history. In fact, in 2003, UNESCO officially recognized those radio broadcasts from EDSA as part of the world's documentary heritage. The Filipino people showed the entire planet that ordinary people, civilians, unarmed, united, non-violent, could dismantle a dictatorship. That when people power turns collective courage into action, even tyranny will fall. People call it the greatest moment in Philippine history. So why exactly does it feel like nothing changed at all? Bakit nga ba magpahanggang sa ngayon ay lugmok pa rin sa kahirapan ng Pilipinas? Bakit nga ba palala ng palala ang katiwalian sa ating bansa? Why is the Philippines today still drowning in massive corruption? Why are the same political dynasties still ruling the country? These are the questions that millions of Filipinos have been asking for the past 40 years. Ano nga ba ang saysay ng EDSA? So EDSA ended 21 years of authoritarian rule and sent the Marcos family into exile. In 1987, a new constitution was ratified. The same constitution that still governs the Philippines today. It established presidential term limits, an independent judiciary, a commission on human rights, and protections for civil liberties and press freedom. Political prisoners were released. Democratic elections resumed. It also explicitly banned political dynasties. Now, in 2013, a landmark law finally acknowledged the dictatorship's human rights violations. Over 11,000 victims received compensation. But the thing is, recognition and reparations are not the same as full accountability. In fact, many of those responsible for all these atrocities were never held to account. Justice, in the fullest sense, remains elusive. But it doesn't mean that nothing has changed. The freedom you're using right now to watch this video, to post whatever you want on social media, even to hate or criticize any president or politician openly, all of that exists because of EDSA. Without EDSA, the internet in the Philippines today would most likely be censored, just like in China or North Korea, where speech and access to the internet is tightly controlled and tightly censored, or even in Myanmar, where access to the internet can simply be shut down. These are not small things. But let's be honest, the 1987 Constitution literally banned political dynasties. But the thing is, the enabling law was never passed. 40 years later, the same families dominate Philippine politics. Corruption did not end with Marcos. Poverty remains widespread. The promises that democracy would transform the lives of ordinary Filipinos has only been partially fulfilled. And as mentioned, genuine justice remains elusive. In fact, on January 22nd, 1987, less than a year after EDSA, farmers marched to Mendiola in front of the Malacanang Palace, demanding land reform during the presidency of Corazon Aquino. But then, security forces opened fire. 13 farmers were killed. Dozens more were injured. The Mendiola massacre revealed something deeper, that removing a dictator did not remove the system that protected the powerful at the expense of the poor. In fact, to this day, comprehensive land reform never happened. Political dynasties stayed in power. The same elite families continued to dominate politics. And the activists who built the resistance continued to be red-tagged and targeted under every government that followed. Ang sabi nga sa isang kanta, hindi pula't dilaw tunay na magkalaban hanggat mas marami ang lugmok sa kahirapan at ang hustisya ay para lang sa mayaman. Habang may tatsulok at sila ang nasa tuktok, hindi matatapos itong gulo. The song is reminding us that until we dismantle the structures that keep inequality in place, the systems that allow power to be concentrated at the top while millions of people struggle below, the promises of the people power revolution remains unfinished. Until we address the roots of these injustices and exploitation, genuine peace, justice, and prosperity in our communities will remain elusive. We must also face the fact that we became complacent after EDSA. We treated EDSA like the destination instead of the starting point. We restored democracy without finishing the work to make it serve everyone, genuinely serving the people. We failed to uplift the farmers, the workers, the peasants, the indigenous communities, and so many more. The very people who made EDSA possible. Every revolution has a spark, but a spark is not enough. Just think of it like driving a car. You still have to turn the ignition. You cannot just start a car and leave it in park, but still expect to reach your destination. In the same way, a revolution does not move on its own. The people have to drive. The people have to steer. Marami ay may gustong kalimutan natin ang ating sariling kasaysayan, ang sakripisyo ng ating mga kababayan na lumaban at namatay para sa katarungan at para sa ating kalayaan. Huwag nating hayaang mangyari yon. Because when a country forgets why millions of its people took to the streets to fight for their freedom, that will only benefit the powerful and the greedy, not the people and not our motherland. The People Power Revolution is not a fairy tale with a happy ending. EDSA did not fail. We failed EDSA. But it doesn't mean that we are hopeless. In fact, it means that we can still do better. We can still make it right. Freedom means nothing if we don't use it. If we blindly follow politicians, freedom means nothing if we do not take part in the changes we want to see. Freedom is nothing if we do not take action. Dahil ang tunay na pagbabago ay isang napakahabang proseso. Pero hindi ito nagmumula o nagsisimula sa iisang leader o sa iisang pamilya lamang. Ito'y nagsisimula sa ating lahat. Sa katunayan ay napatunayan at nasimulan na natin ito sa EDSA. Subalit hindi pa tayo tapos. Malayo pa tayo sa pangako nito. 40 years ago, over 2 million Filipinos proved something to the world. That ordinary people can bring down a dictatorship through sheer courage and unity. The Philippines gave the world people power. That is our gift to history. Nuns, students, farmers, workers, families, church communities, labor organizers, activists from across the political spectrum, and even children, they all linked arms and refused to move. And we have to remember that they were not strangers. They were someone's parents, our grandparents, someone's children, someone's family. They are the people who truly made EDSA a people power revolution. So this February 25th, wherever you are in the world, remember the people. You know, the ones who walked to EDSA before dawn without knowing what would happen next. The ones who bravely prayed in front of tanks. Everyone who linked arms on that highway without knowing if they would live another day. These are the people we have to remember, the people we have to honor. Not the politicians, not the generals, not the dynasties. The everyday people who bravely fought for our freedom. Sila ang mga tunay na bayani. Pagkat hindi ito kwento ng mga Marcos o ng mga Aquino. Ito ay kwento ng isang sambayanang nanindigan sa kabila ng mga panganib. Pagkat ang tunay na diwa, saysay at aral ng EDSA ay ang katotohanan na nasa ating mga mayan ang tunay na kapangyarihan. Nasa atin ang paraan ng tunay na pagbabago. Nasa ating pagkakaisa at sama-samang pagkilos ang tunay na susi sa isang maunlad na bayan, sa isang makatarungang lipunan at mapayapang kinabukasan. Maraming salamat po o Kapampangan dakalpong salamat kay Hongan at Ilocano Agyamanak Launay. See you next time, mga Tagalog kita kits and Kapampangan. Bikitix and Binisaya, kita ay ta.